Hello everyone, my name is Nathan Boggs and my research has been done on violence, specifically violence that's done in the media. So for the purposes of this presentation, I've operationally defined the types of media as three main types: auditory, visual, and submersive, because there hasn't been a lot of textbook definitions on what media is, so we're going to be focusing on these three. The auditory media being music, radio, any verbal stories, or reading. Visual being more television, movies, anything you can kind of watch. And then submersive, right now, it's really only one main type, which is video games, although in the future we'll probably be able to add virtual reality games to that, or virtual reality movies, things of the like, but as of right now, really only video games are really submersive types of media. So you might be thinking to yourself, why is this really important? Well, the reason for that is because with the amount of violence that's on the rise, there's a lot of aggression that's being covered, a lot of violence that's on the rise with the school shootings and all these mass acts of terrorism. We might be thinking, why is aggression becoming so much on the forefront? Where's all this violence coming from? And the thing about it is that there's been a whole bunch of research done on all types of media, whether it be visual, auditory, or submersive, and there's a lot of conflicting information there. A lot of the research is saying, well, yeah, there's a definite correlation. We found it right here, and then there's other research that's saying, no, that's not true whatsoever. There is no correlation, and we have research to prove that. So it's kind of trying to figure out what is real and what's not real. So we start off with Dafar, Ogami, Bomarik, Al-Jard, and Safair, which conducted research out of Saudi Arabia. They focused on early teenagers, on children, really didn't want to focus too much on adults because they wanted to focus more on the people who still have their brains developing and what kind of effect that this violent media would have. And they've actually focused on submersive media, specifically video games, and how much time was spent playing video games, and whether or not this could lead to any kind of heightened aggression that they could observe. And what they found was they actually found significance in violent media specifically, violent video games specifically, and that children and early teenagers who were playing these early video games, were playing these aggressive, violent video games, were actually found to have more heightened aggression versus those who weren't. And at first, this evidence looks pretty convincing until we start looking at some of the strengths and weaknesses. And some of the strengths that we have here is that they are looking at 3 different institutions. 2 of them are pediatric hospitals and one's just a general hospital. And they do have a pretty high sample size. But once we start looking at the weaknesses, where everything kind of starts boiling out, because the very first thing that is a very glaring problem is that they have very low generalizability. And the reason why they have such a low generalizability is because they were excluding non-Arabic speakers. They were very region-specific. They weren't allowing anybody who wasn't Arabic in on this, so we can't look at this outside of the Saudi Arabic nation itself. It was very region-specific, and they had 53% of their participants who were people who were signing up to do it. Thus doing a kind of a bias. They were doing a volunteer bias. But the people who were volunteering to participate in this correlational study, 53% of them had a strong military background, which saw a lot of fighting, a lot of bloodshed, especially in a war-torn area of Saudi Arabia being in the Middle East. There's a lot of fighting going on, so there's a lot of different militaries that happen to that. There's just no good way that they showed that they were able to say that the military background wasn't a part of it, which leads to the very last point of very poor restraint for third variables. So we don't exactly know what's going on, just know that there's a heightened aggression there. And then once we start looking at other research like Adachi and Willoughby, we start to see like maybe there is other things going on here and why it's so important to control third variables. And so what Adachi and Willoughby did was they looked at competitiveness as well as aggression to see if that could be something that was moderating or something that was just a whole nother factor in and of itself. And while they found non-significance for aggression Whether it relates to violence, the pace of the action, or difficulty, what they did find was significance for competitiveness, which which shows that there are other things going on just other than violent game, violent people. And this proves that there is challenge that we can show to previous research by just adding one other variable, it throws everything out of whack. So once we start looking at other types of media, we start kind of focusing on auditory now with Fearing et al. In 2018, who wanted to look at the psychological and social changes of live music. What they did, they analyzed 4,624 different police calls, and the purpose for this was they're trying to see if there's a significance in live music, whether or not violent music that was being played live was causing more calls to the police and making the crowd go a little bit more wild. And they decided to use hip hop as their violent genre because it is more prone to drug references, reference to violence. So what they ended up finding was that there was no significance between not just violent music versus other genres of music, but that no one genre of music was had significantly more police phone calls versus any other one. So some strengths and weaknesses from this particular study is that there was a very large sample size of over 4,000, and it focused more on that social aspect of media versus psychological, where a lot of different research focuses solely on the psychological. They did more of a social aspect of it, and it was done over the course of 5 years, from 2007 to about 2012, 2013. And then some of the weaknesses were that it was only done in one city, and it has not since been replicated, so there is the chance that that was just a fluke occurrence and that these findings actually don't mean anything, and we won't know that until the study gets replicated. So what we can do moving one step further is we can look at the neural aspect of it, which is what Arjmand, Hochhagen, Patton, and Rickard set out to look at. And what they did is they took 18 different participants to listen to 4 different stimuli, being pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, or no sound whatsoever. And one of the things that makes them different is they looked at pleasant, unpleasant for each participant itself. So what they considered was pleasant and unpleasant versus what the researchers thought was pleasant and unpleasant, which actually changes things a little bit because that's going on people's personal preference versus one baseline for it. And what they found was that emotionally pleasant music can be detected by central markers and peak frontal asymmetry associated with particular social events. That's what they were looking for. And what they ended up finding was that there were significant interaction effects with the frontal electrodes and no significant effect on the control pair, with the greatest significance being with pleasant music. There was also evidence found to show evidence to support the theory that peak frontal asymmetry being associated with a particular type of music. Now, what exactly does that mean? It means that auditory media does, in fact, have a significant and considerable effect on the brain, and that we can have pleasurable music activate parts of the brain regardless of if it is considered violent or not. If people like it, it's going to activate those pleasurable sensors of the brain. And then future research could help treat depression or locate individuals who are genetically or environmentally prone for those violent outbursts. That way, we might be able to see we might be able to pick out people who are more susceptible to do school shootings earlier on by being able to branch off on this research. And the last study that we're going to be looking at today is De La Torre Luc, Diaz Pedra, and Buela Caso. And they focused on the concept of if graduate students are able to relax based on music, which they had a control that was no music and an experimental group that was preferred musical stylings. They also were looking at cardiovascular readings as well as musical stylings. They were also doing self-reports at that time too. And what they found was that significance was found in the experimental group with lower levels of anxiety, depression, and overall negative affect. And they found higher levels of positive affect during recovery periods. So what can we get out of this? We can get that not only is there just a biological aspect related to media that research is lacking, there's also research showing that there's a neural link to media and positive effects. And there are new findings that are being derived from both psychological and social aspects, which could be finding alternatives to these false positives of previous research that just looked at is media causing aggression, and it's kind of bridging the gap between why those false positives are happening. And these same findings could be bridging the gap in explaining why so much research has found correlations between aggression, violence, and the media. That is all for this presentation. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, I have my email address listed. Thank you so much for hanging out with me and listening to my presentation, and have a wonderful day.